going to have our next panel now about leveraging data to assure medical progress. And if you think about it, data has been addressed in every single step down the road today, starting with the director of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, who was talking about the importance of data and getting it up to date, up to speed, and used, making it useful and using it. We've heard about data being empowering to people, to institutions, to science, to all of us. So this final panel will delve into data a little more in depth. So on our panel, please welcome Dr. Joe Selby, the Executive Director for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, Dr. Jeff Andrews, Worldwide Director of Women's Health and Cancer, BD Sciences, Dr. Ned Braunstein, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs, Pharmacovigilance and Risk Management at Regeneron, Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, Executive Vice President of the National Health Council, Dr. Keith Yamamoto, Vice Chancellor for Science Policy and Strategy at UCSF, as well as the Director of UCSF's Precision Medicine Program and a Research America board member, and Dr. Peter Marks, Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, at the FDA. Our moderator is one of Research America's own, Jenny Luray, our senior advisor, whose background spans leadership roles in the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Am I connected? We're all connected? Great. Well, I love Washington because where else could you start a panel about health data right after lunch and have everybody smiling? Maybe in Silicon Valley, but this is going to be a terrific panel. I'm just going to provide a little context. Since the passage of 21st Century Cures, and as well as the last round of user fee legislation, real-world data, try to say that 3 times fast, don't, real-world data. You start sounding like Bugs Bunny. Real-world data and real-world evidence were made priorities in that legislation. And since then, there's been a huge growth in both the use of this type of data and also the experimentation around it. How it works, what are the pitfalls, how is it better or worse than the traditional random controlled trials, when does it fit for purpose? And that's what we're going to discuss this afternoon. We have a panel that really spans the research continuum from discovery to delivery of care and representing our ecosystem. And we're going to talk about, first of all, what do we mean by real-world data and real-world evidence? If you're like me, every time you open a trade press, you see a headline about this topic. But let's delve into it. What is it really? Why does it matter to research, to product development, to the quality of care, as well as to patient empowerment, as we heard in the last panel? And then also, how can we build upon the progress to date? So let's first paint a picture of real-world data, and we're going to get examples from our panelists. But before that, I'm going to turn to Peter, and I'm going to ask Peter to provide us with just a core definition. What's real-world data? What is real-world evidence?
So the answer is simple. It's what's going to fix all of pharma's problems. Actually, it's actually an insider joke because it's often bandied about that way. But I think what we mean by real-world data are data that are accessible from routine care, from routine going about medical practice that do not require specific collection. Now, there's a gray zone there. Could data that's collected by a wearable that goes into a database, could that be real-world data? Sure, it could. But the idea is it's distinguished from what we do in our traditional clinical trials where we create a database and somebody specifically enters something for the trial. When we talk about real-world evidence, what we're talking about is what you do with those data that are collected in the process of routine care or in the process of going about daily life in order to come to some inference about whether some intervention is effective or not. And that may not be the perfect definition. Some people may beg to differ or may extend it, but I think that's just a reasonable place to start.
Terrific. Anybody want to augment what Peter shared? Joe?
Well, first of all, I definitely agree with Peter's definition, but I would just point out that sometimes people think of real-world data as observational studies, if you will, studies that you can just do from your computer without intervening on patients. But real-world data can lead to real-world clinical trials or pragmatic trials too, and real-world data can make those trials much more efficient, more affordable to conduct on the one hand, but also can extend it to settings and patient populations that make the results more generalizable. So I think sometimes we tend to think of real-world evidence as just observations of real-world data, and real-world data lend themselves to much more in the way of clinical research, and that might be the connection to pharma someday.
Yeah. And I think actually the place to expand upon that a little bit more perhaps is that there's nothing that says that you could not do, for instance, a randomized controlled trial using real-world data. It's just a matter of how you would actually implement that and then use the evidence that's generated.
Okay, terrific.
Can I add to
yes,
that?
please,
Yeah.
Eleanor.
I want to make this more like The View, like the last panel. So I'll add something that's maybe a little bit more controversial. With the National Health Council, when 21st Century Cures was passed, and there was more of a discussion about real-world data and real-world evidence and how it has the potential to be used in regulatory decisions, we at the National Health Council did some work with our members, patient advocacy organizations, to be sure that they were on top of what was happening here, and that we would have a capacity among the patient advocacy community to really know what was happening with the FDA's work, understand it, get involved in it, be able to translate that information to their constituents so that the information could be used. And we held a one-day panel where we had roundtables very much like this, and we had a little session to describe what real-world data and real-world evidence are, and then we set some work groups happening where we gave people questions. What do you think of this kind of information? Would you use it? Have you used it in the past? And are you comfortable with this description of what it is and the definition? And we had one individual who said, claims data? Electronic health records? That's not real. The information I give you is what's real. And so I think it was really an interesting, interesting view of, you're looking at claims data, you're looking at electronic medical records. That's still, it happens in the course of real care being delivered, but it really doesn't represent what's really happening with that individual. And so one of the important takeaways is, it's a piece of the puzzle, and there are still other pieces to be filled in.
That's terrific, Eleanor. And in a minute, we're going to have you talk about what you're doing to help train researchers to build in that patient perspective. So we can start developing some data that does reflect patient preferences. But why don't we go down the line? Keith, you want to share an example from your work at UCSF? You've been a leader in precision medicine. How do you see real-world data helping you in discoveries in that area?
There's lots of ways to answer that, and maybe I'll expand a little bit more on it deeper into the discussion. But since Peter started out, let me just give an example of something that we've been evolving actually since the roundtable that Research America organized that we were happy to host at UCSF. On real-world data, real-world evidence, and it is hard to say that fast. And tell you that we've launched, in part as an outcome of that roundtable, launched the UCSF Center for Real-World Evidence. We're approaching this in a number of different directions, but the one that's actually gotten launched is a set of partnerships with pharma. In which we are using our extensive data across the UC Medical Center system. We have 15 million unique medical records there to interrogate the outcomes of the use of various drugs. And we're starting with certain kinds of cancers and with some neurological diseases, with drug companies that have put on the market therapeutics for these indications. And so the idea is to look across that spectrum of 15 million records, find the patients that have been treated with these various drugs, and find out identify those for whom it's worked, for those who've created negative side effects, and for those for whom it's had no effect whatsoever. We all know that the FDA's work in being able to assure safety and efficacy extends through the ranked 3 phases of trials. But the FDA and I think knowledgeable people all know that the real trial is after the drug gets onto the market. And there's enough penetrance, there's enough data, enough patients that have been treated to be able to really see what's going on. And so we think that with the data that we have already accumulated in our patient records, then we will be able to tell drug companies, we'll be able to stratify the patient base in ways that will be informative for those to identify patients that are helped, those that are not, those that have negative indications or side effects. And I think that that's a really interesting use of real-world data that can extend to really kind of thinking in a more structured way about what could really become a standard phase 4 type trial that will extend out after the drug goes onto the market.
Terrific. Well, Eleanor, I'm going to pivot a little, and I still want some more examples, but Keith raised an interesting point about the data that's often collected once a product is on the market because it's being used by a wider array of the population. Eleanor, does real-world data help us to do some of this earlier on in the process? So as opposed to creating a small sample, a small population, and doing a traditional random controlled trial, can we see how these interventions are working among a much more diverse cross-section of people earlier on?
I think that that's one of the big advantages to using these databases, and I think the FDA has traditionally used many of these databases in that way to look for those safety signals or those kinds of events that might be happening once the product's used out in larger populations. So I think there is a real opportunity there to collect information about how is it really being used. Is it really being used according to the label? Is it really being used in other ways? What are some of those potential signals for adverse events that might happen? What are some of the potential positive things that might be happening that were not anticipated? Because you can have things that are efficacy related or effectiveness related in the real world that you might not have picked up in trials. So the potential is there, and I think if we think very broadly, and the way that we think about this at the Council is, let's not think about just those regulatory advantages, but in real care, what could we learn that could be advantageous through real-world data, through these kinds of effectiveness studies that could really help improve care and not so much worry about a product or the implications of a product. What can we do that really makes care better for patients and helps their decision making, to help them learn what's going to be better for me when I'm making this choice of the options that I have?
Would you like to share an example now?
I have to think of one.
Well, we can come back to you.
Okay.
Ned, tell us about what Regeneron is doing, and maybe you can share how your genetics center is also being paired with real-world data during your discovery process.
Yeah, I think when we think about real-world evidence, one thing we haven't really talked about is human genetic data coupled with patient databases, especially outcomes databases. You know, in the last panel, there was a discussion about identifying genetic evidence for the genetic causes, rather, of certain rare diseases. And there we think about mutations causing disease. But actually, just as powerfully in our genetic databases, we can identify variants that are associated with improved outcomes. That individuals and associated with protection from cardiovascular disease, protection from certain cancers, things of that nature. That's really very, very powerful and really gives insight into where one could do drug development. But it also, from the point of view of what we do in drug development, we not only are interested in identifying the outcomes, but we identify the phenotypes that individuals have that possess those variants. And if we can show during development that the drug reproduces very faithfully that same clinical phenotype that you get, for example, in somebody who has a loss of function variant, and now you inhibit the normal gene with the gene product with your drug, and you get the same phenotype, we would have high confidence ultimately that the drug would ultimately produce the same outcome benefit that we've observed in the genetic database without actually having to do, before one actually does the outcome study. And what's really curious is, although animal data can go in human labeling and can be part of some of our decision making, human genetics data and these types of data aren't formally part of the FDA review process. I mean, yes, the reviewers know about the data and it may impact their thinking. And it's also, there's no place for this in labeling. And that's really, I think, a gap in what we do in drug development, because when one thinks about it, with very powerful genetic data and a more simplified clinical trial structure, followed by a real-world evidence approach to then confirming the magnitude of the outcome benefit, because the genetics data is going to tell you the direction, right? You can have a high confidence that you're going to see a benefit, but whether there's a 10% or a 20% or a 50% advantage from inhibiting it, that actually you're going to need some real-world evidence or a clinical study or something of that nature.
Thanks,
but,
Ned. Yeah. Peter, do you want to respond to that before we move on to some more examples? Or I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, you know what? I think one of the things that we're already getting away from here that I just think we have to all just come back to, and this goes back to the definition of real-world evidence. Real-world evidence has to be fit for purpose, right? And that means, what I mean by that is there are things that we're currently capable of doing with real-world evidence today. For instance, finding uncommon adverse events to a vaccine that lead to hospitalization or that lead to some insurance claim. Those things we can do. We can look at the efficacy of a vaccine. In fact, that's one of my examples would be we were able to reproduce the findings of a randomized controlled trial using the CMS database with using standard dose versus high dose influenza vaccine, and actually we're able to extend the findings to use actually hard outcomes of hospitalization versus influenza-like illness, which is what insurers actually care about. It's what they're going to pay for, hospitalization. So that's what the kinds of things we can do, because they're solid endpoints. They're things we can get to in our databases. We can deal with cancer trials where people are alive or dead or in remission or relapsed. The problem is many of the drugs that are developed today don't have those kind of very clear endpoints. I wish they all did, but they don't. If we think about an antihypertensive medicine or sleeping medication, I'm in biologics, but I happen to keep my eye on things, and the last sleeping medication that FDA approved got people to sleep 15 minutes sooner. Real-world evidence is, unless it's coming from some wearable or something, which we're not really at this point, it's not going to get you those kinds of data. So I think when we talk about real-world evidence, we have to think, what is it fit for purpose today with our tools, using the data that we have today, which is, it is a lot of claims database work. There are larger health systems have EHRs, and ultimately, we're at the disadvantage here in the United States compared to perhaps some European countries where they have one EHR across an entire country, where we have essentially a balkanized EHR system.
Thanks, Peter. Well,
just a quick follow-up. In terms of, though, you taking greater advantage of these different types of data, is the problem legislative? Because the rules say substantial evidence of clinical benefit, right, based on well-controlled and well-designed clinical studies. Is it there, or is it a reg issue? Is it a training issue in terms of bringing in new expertise at the agency, or is it, or none of the above?
No, it's probably some of each of the above, although I think we're acutely aware of some of the regulatory issues, and we're dealing with those. Some of it's a matter of getting people acquainted to this, but some of it is just the fit-for-purpose nature of things. I think in oncology, it's very clear that we can use real-world evidence, particularly for second, third indications of an oncology product that's on the market, because real-world data for off-label applications of that product can be collected using that method. It's much more difficult to see how this will work in the pre-market setting, right, where you have to get consent, et cetera, et cetera. So there's where the challenges are to get a product to market with real-world evidence.
Great discussion. I'm going to just move away from this for a minute because I want to make sure that our representative from the medical device and diagnostics sector, Jeff, gets a chance to speak, because the medical device sector has been working with the FDA for, I think, even a little bit longer than the drug sector on real-world data. Jeff, would you like to speak to that? How are you using this data in your regulatory submissions or in the work that you're doing around HPV?
I promised to come into that, and so HPV, and I'm going to use the example of cervical cancer, but I want to play off something Peter said about vaccination, which is the HPV vaccine. So the trials, the science for HPV vaccine were, of course, randomized clinical trials, relatively short term, looking at immune response as the outcome. But it's only now, more than a decade later, that we see what the actual effect is in the population as a whole, what is the incidence of infection, and what are the other effects of reducing certain HPV genotypes on pap smears, colposcopy, and all these other things. And all of that data that's coming in now would be called real-world evidence. I'm very interested in what's called risk-based guidelines. An early example of those would be the Framingham calculator for estimating 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, the Gale model for breast cancer risk, the FRAX model for osteoporosis fracture. Earlier we were talking about who should be on a statin. There's an excellent calculator for that. The first one, the Framingham, that was one study. The lipid calculator that any of us can go on and use now online is based off a meta-analysis. So when we were looking at changing the guidelines in the US, I used to be the medical officer for the medical society that does those guidelines. We realized they would become risk-based. How would we estimate those risks? So we partnered with Dr. Mark Schiffman at the National Cancer Institute and designed a multidimensional risk matrix, which would take in not only randomized controlled data, but real-world data, and then matrix it by analyzing the big data in order to estimate risks. And then these risks are applied against thresholds to determine, do you need treatment? Do you need a diagnostic test like colposcopy? Do you just need to be retested? So when I transitioned into BD, I made sure that all the results of our very large clinical trial were fed. The raw data has gone over to that NCI database. Those risk guidelines are in process. Also, part of that was to bring in a particular real-world data study from the New Mexico HPV and PAP registry, which is the only one of its kind in the United States, a population-based registry for cervical cancer. And then we can save the whole story for later, but then again, working with BD, when we needed to come up with a solution using real-world evidence, I realized that I could go to that registry in New Mexico, and I can talk about that now or later.
Okay, you want to please finish your thought? Yeah.
So when you're doing a screening test for a cancer, in terms of the FDA, you need to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. Safety means it's okay to tell the woman your test was negative, you don't need to be tested again for a period of time. So that's negative predictive value. In order to prove that with a prospective clinical trial, you've got to run the trial 3 to 5 years. To run a 3-year trial takes about 7 years. If someone has been recording everything that's happened to women carefully in a database, and they've stored samples along the way, now you can go and do a study today with a new test on samples that are 5 to 7 years old. You can then look, after you've been blinded, you can look at the results And now you can take that 7-year time frame and compress it down to 6 months or a year. The question you were asking, you can get early results on whether a test is going to be a good test or not. So we formed a partnership with that registry, which also has a sample repository, in order to do a fairly unique study. Now, you have to design a real-world evidence study very carefully, and we did a pre-submission to the FDA, and they looked through our proposal and said that looks like a good design. There's a number of fit-for-purpose criteria that need to be met, but if you can find a good registry, good database, good repository, it's possible to design a good study.
I'm just going to pivot off of that, Jeff, because there is some skepticism around real-world data, for sure. What are some of the potential downsides? So we talked about fit for purpose, and you talked about having to pull together the data in such a way that it would meet approval by the FDA. What were some of the challenges you faced in that real-world evidence situation that you might not have faced in a traditional clinical trial?
So a randomized controlled trial is controlled, and the real-world studies are not so well controlled. The whole reason we did randomized controlled trials is to reduce bias, because bias could give you a false impression of an answer that's not actually the real truth. So you have to figure out other ways of ensuring that you don't have bias there. In a randomized controlled trial, you can use placebos. You can do tests on people who you know were negative in order to prove that the first test was also negative. You don't do those things in the real world, so you have to impute those things. In a randomized controlled trial, you usually collect all your data. In real world data, there's often missing data elements, and you have to decide through an approved methodology how you're going to deal with that missing data. On the other hand, a randomized controlled trial tends to have a group of people who are not fully representative of the population. And by going to real-world evidence, in women's health, for instance, my area, now we can look at adolescents and children. We can look at pregnant women who weren't enrolled in the trial. We can look at people that have 2 or 3 additional diseases who typically don't end up in trials. So you can actually expand the scope. When you also have genetic information and other specific molecular information, now instead of a randomized controlled trial which gives one answer for everybody, you can start looking at individual answers and more personalized medicine.
Terrific. Really, really good overall description. Last but not least, Joe.
If I could just encapsulate a little bit of what Jeff just has said so nicely. One of the unique uses of real-world data, I think, is defining risk for individual patients across any condition. Just because you've got a condition doesn't mean you have a fixed known risk for its adverse outcomes. When you get a drug that has both adverse effects and benefits, you as a clinician, I mean, this is what doctors have done for hundreds of years, try to weigh the risks that a patient is really facing with the toxicities of their therapies, which might have been pretty bad in the days when you were bleeding folks or other kind of invasive treatments. So health systems themselves these days, health plans are using real-world data to risk stratify their populations and offering certain treatments to people whose risk level indicates that they could really expect more benefits than harms from the treatment. And I think we're going to just see more of that every year. And it's very patient-centered. It's a very personalized approach to care. And you can play out any trial in retrospect after the trial is done, and you can find out that most of the benefit was in people who are at very high risk, and the adverse effects happen just as much in the very low-risk people. So that's important information for a patient deciding to take the treatment. Now to my example. I got to get this in. It's a nice example of what doesn't happen often enough, which is delivery systems pooling their data across many systems. So this is crucial. Lots of sort of logistic barriers, but one of PCORI's earliest studies was a study where 32 children's hospitals pooled their claims and the EMR data to address a question that was kind of on the minds of pediatric infectious disease physicians, which is, When I send a patient home from the hospital after a serious infection, do I have to keep putting this PICC line in the child? PICC line is a catheter that goes from the elbow right into the right atrium and delivers high concentrations of antibiotics. And the belief in the US particularly was, over the last 30 or 40 years, was that kids need to keep getting these high doses of antibiotics to really wipe out that last bug. But when you are a parent, or when you're a 2-year-old and you come home from the hospital after, say, a ruptured appendicitis, a severe pneumonia, osteomyelitis, you don't really appreciate that catheter and the splint that's on your elbow that's supposed to keep you calm for 6 weeks while you get your IV antibiotics. So practice had been gradually changing a little faster in Europe, maybe in the US, towards sending kids home on high-dose oral antibiotics. And we were at a point nationally where there was practice variation. Some hospitals sent almost everybody home on high-dose orals. Some hospitals sent everybody home on PICC lines, 100% of kids home on PICC lines. Across 32 children's hospitals, 3 infections. These real-world observational studies showed that for each infection, the kids sent home on high-dose oral antibiotics did as well or better than the kids on PICC lines. Meanwhile, kids on PICC lines were coming back to the hospital for infections, clots, even fractured catheters. 16% of the kids were coming back and either having an ER visit or hospitalization. So you can avoid that. You can avoid the misery of having to keep a 2-year-old quiet for 6 weeks. You can avoid the cost if your healthcare system of nurses to come out every other day and clean and inspect the lines. So very patient-centered, very parent-centered, very system-centered in terms of costs. Change the guidelines. Pediatricians no longer have drastically reduced the use. Observational real-world data study.
Well, as you can see, there's quite an array of examples. So this was terrific. I feel like you've really put some meat on the bones. But now I'm going to pivot to, you talked about patient centricity and the issue of who owns the data. Data privacy, data ownership. There seems to be a new data company that pops up every other day to aggregate and monetize data. Eleanor, what's your perspective on that?
We had an interesting conversation about this because I think in terms of the National Health Council, our vision is that if you're going to be aggregating all of this data, and that includes claims data, digital data, Fitbits, that kind of thing, all the data that might come from social media that's being collected on individuals, let's use it for good instead of evil. Right now it's used to sell you things. So if we could put all that data together and really use it to individualize, personalize care for a person based on all the things that we know about them, not just claims, not just EMRs, but everything that we know about them, because there is so much more out there, that we really could figure out what's important to people, the social determinants of health, which was brought up in the last panel. We could capitalize on all that information and really customize care for the individual patient. Use it for good instead of evil. So that's a vision. It's pie in the sky. In order for us to get to that point, all this data has to be aggregated and put together, and there have to be technologies to be able to use it in the way that we're envisioning. So we're a ways off from that. It is happening in some pockets, but we're a ways off from that. Right now, what we have are large companies that aggregate large volumes of data from various sources, usually health insurance companies and some other places that get appended to that. And patients, people ask, well, are patients afraid of what's happening? The de-identified part of it, if it really can be de-identified, and there are questions about that, patients are willing to share their data. They're willing to share their data for research. They're happy to do that because they know someone can benefit from it. So usually the response that you get is yes, patients are willing to share their data, as long as it's not being abused in some way, that there's privacy, HIPAA, all those kinds of things. But there's also kind of a little bit of a backlash that happens there too when it comes to an insurance company that a patient is paying premiums to and their employer is paying premiums to, and that insurance company aggregates their data and turns it around and sells it to pharma or to whomever. And they're making some money on these data, whether it's the data cuts themselves or they're doing analyses on a contractual basis for someone else. And the individual patients are like, well, wait a minute, if you're going to make some money on this and it's my data that's in there, shouldn't you be cutting my premiums? I'm still paying for this, and you're selling my data. And so maybe my data individually isn't worth a whole lot, but now that you've got 150 million lives in these databases, that is a commodity, but you never asked me. And so is it okay? It's not, there's no answer to that question,
Sure.
but it's kind of like, okay, even if you only gave me a few dollars off my premium, shouldn't you be giving me something for my data? So it's a question to think about in terms of not just the ethics of someone's data being out there and whether or not it's traceable back to them, but what's the ethics of selling something that somebody actually paid you for?
Joe, you and I were talking in the hallway about patient access to data from a portability standpoint. Do you want to
so
share that?
I think all of us on this panel, most of us in this room, feel that we should be able to use real-world data for good purposes, for drug development or for avoiding adverse effects or for reducing costs of care. And yet we have a lot of trouble trying to get, particularly trying to accomplish sharing of data across systems or linking of data between systems or between EMRs and health plans, for example. So we had a bright idea at PCORI to take advantage of the fact that, as Eleanor says, most patients support the use of their data for important patient-centered, perhaps, research purposes. So we asked patients to join us, along with healthcare delivery systems and IRB folks, at a meeting at the National Academies of Medicine. And it was very interesting. The patients basically said, yes, we are supportive of using data for research. That's not a bad idea. We could get behind that. But guess what? We can't access this data. We cannot get our own data. When I need my immunization records for my kids at school, when I take my husband to the emergency room at a different system and they want to know what medicines he's on or what adverse effects, this is not only unethical, and by the way, health plans are said to be even somewhat worse than delivery systems in terms of following through with the Portability Act and making the data available. So I came away from that meeting recognizing, number one, that it is a safety issue. It's not only an ethics issue, but it's a medical care quality and safety issue, and that anyone who pretends to think that they should have access to more real-world data should get on the bandwagon also of supporting delivery of it to patients themselves. That's the beginning to talk to patients about using their data, in fact. So, but it's pretty ironic to talk to them about using their data when they can't use it themselves.
Thank you. Keith?
Jenny, I want to just go back to Eleanor's comments and build on actually two things that you said. One was the notion that so really aggregating and analyzing vast amounts of data is really the principal driving force of precision medicine that really says that if we could do this, pull together all biological information, not experimental systems, as well as individual patients, as well as populations, we could really make a call on diagnosis and therapies and maybe cures and prevention advice down to the level of the individual. And then you said, but that's really pie in the sky. It's going to take a longest time to get there. True in one sense, but I think that one point I'd like to make is that we're discovering as we continue to pursue this is that we don't have to be done for it to work.
Right.
And I think that's really important. And it's just common sense if you think for a minute about how we all make decisions. If somebody came to you and said, let me give you one additional parameter that will help to inform your decision, it'll be a better decision, even though there may be 100 parameters above or below that will be important. So as we begin to build these data systems and knowledge networks, we're finding that it's already having a positive impact. So that's point one. The other one goes back to what Jenny asked us, and that is who owns the data. And the point that you made, Eleanor, was that people were discovering this, as well as you, that people are more and more comfortable with sharing their data, making it available, making it useful for research. But there is anxiety, because as we do a better and better job of pulling all this information together, the notion that it's going to be secure and safe, I mean, there's nobody in this room that believes that a database is secure. And so it's going to get, it'll come. So what do we need to do? Can we make, I don't think we can make laws and regulations that will keep everything completely secure. And we've had some conversations with payers about this, for profit payers as well as nonprofits, to ask them, what would it take for you to have access to data that you could misuse, for you to be nevertheless responsible with that data? And the answer is not going to be surprising to anyone, but it was very clear, and that is that if you could convince us with an economic model that shows that if we have these data and can say to a patient or a medical center, we're not going to reimburse for that drug because it's not going to help that person. We're not going to allow this clinical test to be done because it's not going to make a difference to that person, right? Our costs will go down. Our profits will go up, but we have to be responsible with the information. And they've said, yeah, that could work. We can imagine that that's kind of a system actually working, where if you do misuse it, you're off the board, you don't have access to the information anymore. And so as we progress into this new era of pulling information together, as soon as you tie your genome, which is your one unique identifier in the universe, to any other information about yourself, right, then can have no holds barred. There's a lot of information out there. How can we get people to be confident that this will actually help them and not be used in negative ways? And I think there are routes.
And I think we are going to start the Q&A in 1 minute. I'm supposed to start it now, but
we need.
I'm going to let this conversation just continue briefly, and then we will open it up for questions. So I think Jeff had signaled me first, and then Eleanor.
I want to play off what Keith said and just ask the audience, who has done Ancestry.com? And so we wouldn't share our social security number, but anyone who did that just shared their entire DNA and any other piece of information. I think society's changing. Of course, we need to protect personal health information and provide security and de-identify data. But I think as the generations move forward, they're going to be much more accepting of putting health information into these databases.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay,
but we also need standards and rules if we're going to do studies, right? Because when I do a clinical study, I can say, well, this is done by GCP. So we know what that means. If I look at accounting records, there are certain rules of accounting, so I have some confidence in what I'm looking at. And the same thing would this is a new area, so maybe we call it GWP or...
I just want, and this is really important to say, because a dirty secret here. I've been a provider for years with I was in one of the earlier hospitals that had an electronic health record. Unfortunately, one of the problems with giving people access to their medical information is they see what doctors put into the medical record, and then they learn something that I learned. I review records that come to us for single patient use where the gender of a female is associated with normal male genitalia. So things like this happen in the electronic medical record, and the data that we tend to, this goes to this issue of the data, real world data is unfortunately messy, and people having access to their data also means that providers are going to have to deal with answering questions about what they put in there. And the bane of the medical record, we had a group of PHR providers and healthcare systems together, and the bane is copy-paste. Because it leads to very interesting problems. But this is where exactly the problem we deal with is, how do we know that the information that's there is right?
Okay, Eleanor, really quickly, and then we're going to go to Q&A.
It just two things. It was number one, I wasn't just talking about the genome data, I was talking about all of
Sure.
it. So I think that's an important factor, is that we're talking about the whole package. And the other is, patients have a right to see what's in their medical record, even if there are mistakes in it. So they maybe have a chance of getting those mistakes corrected. And so it is.
That's exactly correct. We're completely on board. We're completely on board with that. But that is exactly one of the challenges that happens once you have this open access. And it would be a wonderful thing if it did happen, because some of these things would get corrected that are currently not correct. And could potentially lead to erroneous conclusions from real-world evidence.
Exactly.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Questions? I think we have one over here.
So who owns the data? Wait for my
Is that like who let
Is that
the
a
dog
trick
out?
question?
Yeah.
Well, do you mean currently or in the best of all possible worlds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think many of us would like to say that a patient should own their, should actually,
Of course.
should have some element of ownership in their data, probably should, and to probably have to, you know, through an informed consent process, agree to share their data or let the aggregators use their data in a larger way. And if they provide that by informed consent, and I don't mean, you know, I just got a new Apple product, for example, and I, you know, in order to use it, I had to skim through 20 pages, which I didn't
call it the
actually read and say, I
uninformed
agree.
consent process.
Right.
Yes.
Right. No,
That's what-
and we don't mean
uninformed
that,
consent.
right?
Yeah.
But something a little bit more, you know, a real informed consent.
Here, sign this, sign this, sign this.
Because proposals come up in the future that couldn't have been contemplated at the time of the informed consent, there has to be an independent third body, an ethics committee, IRB, that reviews a proposal to make sure that it's consistent with what the patient consented to in terms of use of their data.
Yeah, at least conceptually. Right, because there may be details that,
Yeah.
that are not in that informed consent.
Right, and actually, and best practices for real-world evidence are that you actually, when you go about using real-world data to make real-world evidence, you actually, it's as formal as it should be when you do a prospective clinical trial, because you make rules of how you're going to do things.
Do we have time for another question? Do we have another question? Well, yes.
Albert Reach from University of Maryland. The comment about who owns the data, so I'd like to follow up on that. And I think that many institutions on entry will indicate whether patients will allow their data to be used, called an opt-in or opt-out approach. Mm-hmm. So depending on how it is structured, then the data may be owned by, of course, the institution or not. But I think that is one way that many research institutions really provide that option, that patients can specifically direct who can have it and who cannot, and whether they want to maintain that their ownership on a long-term basis.
Joe?
Having just participated in a day-long session on questions like this at Yale Law School last month, I came away impressed that the legal answer to who owns the data is not the patient. Just about everybody in the room said it is not the patient. It's much more a question of medical quality, medical ethics, medical safety that patients should have. The reason is that the data were gathered and stored in a system that is owned by an institution. It was contributed to by physicians, so it's a kind of a moot point who owns the data, and you're not going to get far arguing that way. So I think it's much more important to argue from a medical safety, medical ethics,
protection,
medical quality perspective.
Well, I'm going to ask one closing question of each of you. You have to keep it short because Peter's boss is in the wings, perhaps waiting at this very moment. And my question is, what would be, from your stakeholder position, your role vis-a-vis real-world data, real-world evidence, what is your one wish to really get this field, to really move it forward, to get it to a position where you really feel it can provide the value for patients and for research and innovation? Peter?
So I would say harmonization of electronic health record systems and access to high quality data across the various platforms.
Keith?
Yeah, standardization I think is really the key. Right now what we have, and as I said in the UC system with the 15 million records, is data that are very useful for health services research, but not so useful for basic or clinical research because of the lack of standards and the lack of consistency. So really moving in that direction is really key.
I think I talked about our vision before of using all these data to improve an individual's health. I think I would add to that by saying that patients need to be engaged as part of this process. And so Peter made a reference earlier to the hospitalization being the hard endpoint. And I think the question is, well, hospitalization may be important to the payer, but patients and others who have these questions, hospitalization may not be very important to them. With flu, it could be, I want to be able to go back to work. An employer would say, I want productive employees. People who have children would say, I want to be able to take care of my kids and not pass the flu on to my kids. So there are a lot of other very important endpoints in healthcare delivery and in healthcare decision making that get beyond the hospitalization that the insurer is working with. So,
and we may not be collecting that data right now.
And we most likely are not collecting those data right now. And so thinking about how do we integrate the thinking that we have now around patient-focused drug development, patient-focused clinical trials, can we also take that same perspective and put that in the real-world data research world to say, okay, we're not looking for the keys under the lamppost. We have this endpoint, so that's the one we're going to study. We've got to be sure that we're studying the important endpoints.
Okay. Ned?
Yeah, beyond just
beyond
the standardization of the data and the databases, really more along the lines of standardization agreement on the processes that we use to actually conduct these studies, the rigor that would go into the study, the design of the study, some agreement on what that would look like, and some guidance perhaps on all that.
And I know the FDA is working hard on that.
That's right.
Real-world evidence can lead to faster, less expensive research, but only if we have the databases and repositories established with high-quality information. We need to start now. Australia, New Zealand, 9 European countries have nationwide databases and repositories of specimens, tumors, blood, urine, etc., all of which we can go back to when we get a new technology. The United States needs to stimulate that and start building our own databases and our own repositories.
Terrific. Joe, you've got the last word.
A wish that would enable a lot of the things that have been said before is that the systems that own the data, the health plans that own the data, need to be brought into the mix. We can't think of them as kind of outside entities that have to be pushed further outside so that we can get to the data. They need to be brought in, and that would make us more of a system like some of the countries you mentioned, where everybody's in it together. Sponsors, industry, or federal agencies need to be at the same tables as the systems and the health plans to understand what kind of questions we can ask and answer, and which questions are really to the advantage of patients and their clinicians. So I think that kind of common purpose would get rid of a lot of these barriers, standardization, IRB barriers, and other barriers to data sharing, proprietary concerns.
Terrific. Well, I've learned a lot. I hope you all have too. Let's give a round for our fabulous